The blood had already frozen into dark crystals on Franklin Garrison's shirt by the time Delilah Turner's boots crunched through the snow-laden undergrowth of the Kansas wilderness. It was December 1882, and the cold had settled into the land like a vengeful spirit, turning everything brittle and dangerous. She had been tracking a deer for the better part of 2 hours, her rifle steady in her gloved hands, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The last thing she expected to find was a man dying beneath a twisted oak tree, his face pale as the snow that had begun to drift over his legs. Delilah stopped dead in her tracks, the deer forgotten entirely. Her practical mind immediately assessed the situation even as her heart lurched in her chest. The man was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair matted to his forehead and a wound in his side that had bled through his coat. His eyes were closed, his lips tinged blue, and for a terrible moment she thought he was already gone. Then she saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest, so faint it was almost imperceptible. "Mister," she called out, moving closer with caution. Her father had taught her never to approach a stranger without care, especially not out here in the woods northwest of Wilson, Kansas, where outlaws and drifters were as common as prairie dogs. But this man looked past the point of being a threat to anyone. She knelt beside him, setting her rifle within arm's reach and pressed her fingers to his throat. His pulse was there, weak and thready but present. Franklin's eyes fluttered open at her touch, unfocused and glassy with pain and cold. He tried to speak, but only a rasping sound emerged. Delilah could see the desperation in his gaze, the fear of a man who knew he was close to death. "Easy now," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I am going to get you out of here, but you need to stay with me. Can you hear me?" He managed the smallest of nods, and she felt a surge of determination. Delilah Turner was not a woman who gave up easily. At 23, she had been hunting these woods since she was tall enough to hold a rifle, helping her father provide for their small ranch after her mother passed when Delilah was just 16. She knew survival, knew the land, and knew that if she left this man here to fetch help, he would be dead before she made it back to Wilson. She worked quickly, tearing strips from her own wool petticoat to pack against the wound in his side. The stab wound was deep, and she could tell from the angle that whoever had done this had meant to kill him. The blood had slowed to a sluggish seep, which was both good and bad. Good because he was not bleeding out actively, bad because it likely meant his body was shutting down from the cold. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, and then she pressed the wadded fabric hard against the wound. Franklin's body jerked, a strangled sound escaping his throat, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on her face. She could see him trying to focus, trying to stay conscious. "That is it. Stay with me." "What is your name?" "Frank," he managed to whisper, the word barely audible. "Franklin." "I am Delilah," she told him, wrapping another strip of fabric around his torso to hold the makeshift bandage in place. "And you picked a hell of a place to get yourself stabbed, Franklin." Despite everything, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, as if he wanted to smile at her blunt words. Good. If he could still appreciate dark humor, he was not too far gone. The real problem was getting him back to her horse. She had left her mare, Bess, tied about a quarter-mile back where the trees thinned out. Franklin was tall and solidly built, and Delilah was strong but not strong enough to carry a full-grown man that distance. She would have to get him on his feet somehow, let him lean on her, and pray they could make it. "Franklin, I need you to help me here," she said, positioning herself beside him and working her arm under his shoulders. "On 3, we are going to stand up. 1, 2, 3. It was an ugly, painful process. Franklin groaned as she hauled him upward, his weight sagging against her immediately. His legs could barely support him, and she had to brace herself to keep them both from tumbling back into the snow. But they were upright, and that was something. "Left foot," she instructed, and they began the agonizing journey through the woods. Every step was a battle. Franklin's breathing came in harsh gasps, and twice he nearly collapsed, but Delilah held firm, her jaw set with determination. She talked to him the whole way, nonsense mostly, anything to keep him conscious. "My father is going to think I am the worst hunter in Kansas," she said as they stumbled over a fallen branch. "Been out here all morning and coming back with a half-dead man instead of venison. Though I suppose you are heavier than a deer, so that is something." Franklin made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. His hand clutched at her shoulder, holding on with what little strength he had left. When they finally reached Bess, the bay mare snorted and sidestepped nervously at the smell of blood. Delilah soothed her with soft words while keeping Franklin upright, which was no small feat. Getting him onto the horse was another challenge entirely. Bess was tall and Franklin could barely stand, much less climb into a saddle. "I am going to need you to give me everything you have left," Delilah told him, leading Bess beside a fallen log. She helped Franklin onto the log first, which at least gave him some height, and then with a combination of pushing, pulling, and sheer stubborn will, she managed to get him belly down over the saddle. It was not dignified, and it would be uncomfortable as hell, but it would keep him on the horse. She swung up behind him, sitting as far back as she could while keeping one arm locked around his torso to steady him. With her other hand, she gathered the reins and urged Bess into a careful walk. Every jolt made Franklin groan, but Delilah kept them moving. The ride back to the Turner ranch took nearly an hour, and by the time they arrived, Delilah's arm was numb from holding him and her back ached from the awkward position. Her father, Daniel Turner, came running out of the barn when he heard Bess's hooves in the yard. He was a weathered man of 52 with gray streaking through his brown hair and hands that had worked this land for decades. "Delilah, what in God's name?" he called out, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "Found him in the woods, stabbed and left for dead," Delilah said quickly. "Help me get him inside." Daniel did not waste time with questions. He grabbed Franklin's shoulders while Delilah supported his legs, and together they carried him into the house. They laid him on the worn sofa in the front room, and Delilah immediately began stoking the fire in the hearth to blazing life. The house was warm compared to outside, but Franklin was still shaking with cold, his skin clammy to the touch. "I will ride for Doc Brennan," Daniel said, already heading for the door. "There is no time," Delilah countered, pulling off Franklin's frozen coat. "Look at him, Pa. He will not last another hour and the doc is in Wilson." "That is an hour there and an hour back even if you ride hard and find him at his office." Daniel hesitated, his jaw working. Then he nodded grimly. "You will need hot water, whiskey for the wound, and my sewing kit." They had done this before, patched up injuries on the ranch when help was too far away. Delilah had steady hands and a strong stomach, necessities when living on the frontier. While her father boiled water and gathered supplies, she cut away Franklin's shirt to expose the wound properly. It was a vicious thing, the knife having entered just below his ribs on the left side. The blade had been thin, she could tell by the clean edges of the wound, but deep. She could only hope it had not pierced anything vital. Franklin drifted in and out of consciousness as she worked, which was probably a mercy. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, the harsh alcohol making his body jerk even in his semi-conscious state. Then, with her father holding a lamp close, she began the delicate process of stitching the wound closed. Her hands did not shake, though her heart was pounding. Each stitch had to be precise, the thread drawn tight but not too tight. "Who do you think did this?" Daniel asked quietly as she worked. No idea, Delilah replied, her eyes never leaving her work. But they meant to kill him, left him out there to freeze after they stabbed him. If I had been an hour later or if I had gone east instead of north, he would be dead. Providence, maybe, her father said, or just dumb luck. Either way, he is alive now, Delilah said, tying off the final stitch. She sat back, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. The wound was closed, bandaged with clean cloth, and she had done all she could. Now it was up to Franklin's body to fight off infection and recover from the trauma and cold. They moved him to the small bedroom that had once belonged to Delilah's older brother, before he headed west to California 5 years prior. It was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the snow-covered prairie. Delilah piled blankets on top of Franklin, tucking them around him to trap what little body heat he had. His shaking had subsided, but his skin was still too pale, his breathing too shallow. "I will sit with him," she told her father. "You should get some rest." Daniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You did good today, Del. Your mother would be proud." The words settled warm in her chest, a rare show of sentiment from her usually stoic father. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Daniel squeezed her shoulder before leaving her alone with Franklin. Delilah pulled a chair close to the bed and settled in for what she knew would be a long night. She changed the cold compresses on Franklin's forehead every hour, trying to manage the fever that set in as his body fought the trauma. She checked his bandages for fresh bleeding, relieved when they stayed mostly clean. And she talked to him, even though he could not hear her, because the silence of the winter night felt too heavy otherwise. "You are going to have to wake up and tell me what happened," she said softly, wringing out another cloth in cool water. "Because I am mighty curious about who you are, Franklin, and why someone wanted you dead badly enough to stab you and leave you in the middle of nowhere." The only answer was the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the howl of wind outside the window. Snow had begun to fall again, thick and heavy, covering the world in white. Delilah was glad they had made it back when they did. Another hour and the storm would have made travel impossible. Franklin remained unconscious through that night and into the next day. His fever spiked and broke again, his body waging a war against infection and trauma. Delilah barely left his side, catching short naps in the chair while her father handled the ranch work. Daniel brought her meals and fresh water, checked on their patient, and asked no questions about why Delilah was so devoted to saving a complete stranger. The truth was, Delilah was not entirely sure herself. Maybe it was because she had been the one to find him, and that made him her responsibility. Maybe it was because she had looked into his eyes in those woods and seen a fierce will-to-live that matched her own stubborn nature. Or maybe it was simply because out here on the frontier, you helped people when you could, because someday you might be the one who needed help. On the second night, Franklin's fever finally broke for good. Delilah woke from a doze in her chair to find his eyes open, clear and aware for the first time since she had found him. They were brown, she noticed, a warm brown like good earth, and they were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are awake," she said, sitting up straighter and trying to shake off the fog of exhaustion. "How do you feel?" "Like I got stabbed and left for dead in the woods," Franklin replied, his voice rough from disuse but touched with dry humor. Then his expression softened. "You saved my life." "I found you," Delilah corrected. "Pure accident. I was hunting deer." "Thank God for hungry hunters, then," he said, and this time his smile was real if weak. It transformed his face, she noticed, made him look younger and less like death warmed over. She poured him water from the pitcher on the bedside table and helped him drink, supporting his head with her hand. He was still weak as a newborn calf, but there was color in his face now, and his eyes were alert. These were good signs. "What is your full name?" she asked, settling back in her chair. "And what happened to you out there?" Franklin was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window where snow still fell in lazy spirals. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with anger and grief. "Franklin Garrison. I was a deputy in Wilson until 3 days ago. Me and the sheriff were tracking a gang that had robbed the bank. We caught up with them about 10 miles northwest of town. There were 4 of them, and it turned into a shooting match." He paused, his jaw tight. "Sheriff got killed. I took one of them down, but another got close while I was reloading. He stabbed me and they left me there. Figured the cold would finish what the knife started." Delilah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "The Sadler gang," she guessed. She had heard about the bank robbery. The whole town had been talking about it. 3 men dead, including a clerk, and nearly $2,000 stolen. Franklin nodded grimly. "Jack Sadler and his boys. They are long gone now, probably halfway to Colorado by this point." "Maybe not," Delilah said slowly. "The storm hit the day after I found you. If they were traveling, they would have had to hole up somewhere. They might still be within reach." Franklin tried to sit up, then fell back with a gasp of pain, his hand going to his bandaged side. "I need to get word to the marshal in Salina. Those men need to hang for what they did to Sheriff Porter." "What you need to do is lie still and heal," Delilah said firmly, pressing him back against the pillows with one hand. "You are not going anywhere for at least a week, probably longer. I did not stitch you back together just so you could tear yourself open again being stupid." He looked like he wanted to argue, but his body had other ideas. His face had gone pale again from just that small exertion, and his breathing was labored. Delilah could see the frustration in his eyes, the helplessness of a man used to action forced into stillness. "I will tell my father," she said, her voice gentler. "He can ride into Wilson tomorrow when the storm clears and talk to the mayor. They can send word to Salina, get the marshals involved. But you need to rest, Franklin. You almost died out there." "I know," he said quietly, his gaze finding hers. "I remember bits and pieces. You talking to me in the woods, telling me to stay with you, feeling like I was made of ice from the inside out, and your face when I first opened my eyes. I thought maybe I had died and you were an angel." Delilah felt heat rise in her cheeks, unexpected and unwelcome. She was not used to such words, especially not from handsome young men with earnest brown eyes. "I am no angel," she said briskly, standing up to fuss with his blankets unnecessarily. "Just a hunter who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Then I am lucky you were," Franklin said, and there was something in his voice that made her heart do a strange little flip in her chest. She excused herself to get him some broth, needing a moment to collect herself. In the kitchen, her father was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, and he looked up at her with knowing eyes. "He is awake." "Yes. He says he is a deputy from Wilson, was tracking the gang that robbed the bank. They are the ones who did this to him." Daniel's expression darkened. "The Sadler gang. I heard Sheriff Porter was killed. That is a damn shame. He was a good man. Franklin wants word sent to the marshals. I told him you would ride into Wilson tomorrow." "I will leave at first light," Daniel agreed. Then he studied his daughter's flushed face and added, "He is a good-looking young man." "Pa," Delilah said, exasperated. "Just making an observation," Daniel said mildly, but there was a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "You have been nursing him for 2 days straight without a complaint. That is not nothing." "I would do the same for anyone," Delilah protested, but even she could hear how weak the argument sounded. "Maybe so," her father said, but the way you are blushing suggests this one might be different." Delilah grabbed the pot of broth from the stove with more force than necessary and retreated back to Franklin's room before her father could see just how right he was. The truth was, there was something about Franklin Garrison that had gotten under her skin. Maybe it was the circumstances of how they met, the raw vulnerability of finding him dying in the snow. Or maybe it was the strength she had seen in him even at his weakest, the determination to live, the dry humor in the face of pain. Whatever it was, Delilah found herself caring about this stranger in a way that went beyond simple Christian charity. Over the next few days, Franklin grew stronger. He graduated from broth to solid food, and the pain in his side lessened to a dull ache instead of a sharp agony. Delilah changed his bandages daily, relieved to see the wound healing cleanly with no signs of infection. She attributed that small miracle to the cold that had slowed his bleeding and to the whiskey she had poured liberally over the wound. Daniel had ridden into Wilson and spoken with the mayor and the temporary sheriff, a man named Collins who had been a deputy alongside Franklin. Word was sent to Salina, and a marshal was expected to arrive within the week to take up the hunt for the Sadler gang. Franklin chafed at being bedbound, but there was little he could do but rest and let his body heal. Delilah spent hours in that small bedroom, and they talked about everything and nothing. Franklin told her about growing up in Ohio, the son of a blacksmith, and how he had come west at 19 looking for adventure. He had worked as a ranch hand, a stagecoach guard, and finally found his calling as a lawman. He spoke with reverence about Sheriff Porter, who had given him his badge and taught him what it meant to uphold the law with integrity. In turn, Delilah told him about the ranch, about her mother who had died of pneumonia 7 years ago, about her brother who had gone west seeking gold and rarely wrote. She told him about learning to hunt and shoot from her father, about the hard winters and the pride of making the land yield enough to survive. She spoke of her love for the prairie despite its harshness, the way the sunrise could paint the snow in shades of pink and gold, the vast emptiness that felt like freedom. "You are not like any woman I have ever met," Franklin said one afternoon. He was sitting up in bed now, his back propped against the wall, and Delilah was perched on the edge of a chair mending one of her father's shirts. "I will take that as a compliment," Delilah replied, not looking up from her stitching. "It is meant as one," Franklin said. Most women would have left a stranger to die in the woods, would not have had the skill or the courage to do what you did. "You are remarkable, Delilah Turner." Now she did look up, and the sincerity in his eyes made her throat tight. "You give me too much credit. I did what anyone would do." "No," Franklin said quietly. "You did what a good person with a strong heart would do. That is not anyone. That is you." The shirt forgotten in her lap, Delilah found herself caught in his gaze, the air between them suddenly charged with something unspoken. She thought he might say more, but instead he reached out his hand, palm up, an invitation. Without thinking, she placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and real. They stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the winter light filtering through the window painting them both in shades of white and gold. Delilah felt her heart beating hard against her ribs, felt the warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. This was dangerous, she knew. Franklin was a lawman, probably had plans to return to his work once he healed. She was a ranch girl with responsibilities, with a father who depended on her. There was no future in caring for him, but her heart, it seemed, had not received that message. By the end of the first week, Franklin was able to walk around the room with help, and by the middle of the second week, he could make it to the kitchen for meals. He insisted on helping where he could, and Delilah found him one morning attempting to chop vegetables for stew, despite the fact that his hand shook from weakness. "Sit down before you chop off a finger," she said, taking the knife from him with more fondness than exasperation. "You are supposed to be resting." "I have been resting for 2 weeks," Franklin protested. "I am going stir-crazy, Delilah. Let me do something useful." "Fine," she said, pointing to the table. "You can keep me company while I cook. Tell me a story or something." So Franklin sat at the kitchen table and told her about the time he had to arrest a man for stealing a pig, except the pig turned out to belong to a different farmer entirely. And the whole thing turned into a huge mess that involved 3 farmers, 2 pigs, a very confused judge, and a dog who would not stop barking through the whole trial. Delilah laughed until tears streamed down her face, and the sound of her laughter made Franklin smile in a way that reached his eyes and softened the hard edges of his experience. Daniel watched them from the doorway, unnoticed, and saw what his daughter probably did not realize yet. She was falling in love with Franklin Garrison, and from the way the young man looked at Delilah, the feeling was entirely mutual. Daniel was not sure how he felt about that. Franklin seemed like a good man, honest and brave, and he clearly cared for Delilah. But he was also a lawman, and that was a dangerous profession. Daniel had already lost his wife to the harshness of frontier life. The thought of his daughter loving a man who might not come home one day made his chest tight with worry. But he also saw the light in Delilah's eyes when she looked at Franklin, a light that had been missing since her mother died. She had become so serious, so focused on survival and responsibility, that she had forgotten how to simply be young. Franklin made her laugh, made her smile, made her remember that life was about more than just work and duty. So Daniel said nothing, just turned back to his work and let the 2 young people find their way to each other in their own time. The marshal from Salina arrived on a cold morning in late December, just a few days before Christmas. His name was Henry Walsh, a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He spoke with Franklin in the front room while Delilah made coffee and tried not to eavesdrop, though she caught bits and pieces of the conversation. The Sadler gang had been spotted near the Colorado border, but a heavy snow had prevented pursuit. Walsh was putting together a posse to head out after Christmas, and he wanted Franklin's account of what had happened. Franklin told the story in a flat, emotionless voice, but Delilah could see the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of Sheriff Porter's death, the way his hands clenched into fists on his knees. When Walsh left an hour later, Franklin sat staring into the fire with an expression that made Delilah's heart ache. She sat down beside him on the sofa, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You are thinking about going with them," she said. It was not a question. "I have to," Franklin replied. "Sheriff Porter was more than just my boss. He was my friend, my mentor. I owe it to him to see his killers brought to justice." "You almost died," Delilah said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Your wound is barely healed. If you ride out there in the dead of winter chasing outlaws, you could tear yourself open again or get shot or freeze to death. Is revenge worth dying for?" "It is not revenge," Franklin said, finally turning to look at her. "It is justice. There is a difference." "Not if you are dead, there is not," Delilah shot back. She stood up, her hands trembling with frustration and fear. "You are being foolish, Franklin. You are not healed enough for this." "Then when?" he asked, standing as well despite the twinge of pain the movement caused. "When will I be healed enough? By the time I am fully recovered, those men will be long gone, probably into Mexico. The trail will be cold and they will get away with murder. I cannot let that happen." They stood facing each other, the air between them crackling with tension. Delilah wanted to shake him, wanted to make him see sense. but she also understood, deep down, why he felt compelled to go. Honor, duty, justice, these were not just words to Franklin. They were the foundation of who he was. "Promise me you will be careful," she finally said, her voice breaking slightly. "Promise me you will come back." Franklin's expression softened, and he reached out to cup her face with his hand, his thumb brushing her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I promise," he said quietly. "I have something to come back to now." And then he kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Delilah kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palms. It was her first kiss, though she would never admit that to him, and it made her feel like she was flying and falling all at once. When they pulled apart, Franklin rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I am in love with you, Delilah Turner," he whispered. "I think I started falling the moment I opened my eyes and saw you sitting beside my bed like some fierce guardian angel." "I love you too," Delilah whispered back, the words feeling both terrifying and right. "Which is why I am afraid of losing you." "You will not lose me," Franklin promised. "I will come back to you. I swear it." 3 days later, on a morning so cold that the snow crunched like broken glass underfoot, Franklin rode out with Marshal Walsh and a posse of 6 men. He wore a borrowed coat and sat a borrowed horse, his own having been taken by the Sadler gang when they left him for dead. His wound still pained him, but he had wrapped it tight and said nothing to Walsh about the ache in his side. Delilah stood in the yard and watched him go, her heart in her throat. Franklin turned in the saddle to look back at her one last time, and she raised her hand in farewell. Then he was gone, disappearing into the white landscape like a ghost, and Delilah was left with nothing but worry and prayer. The days that followed were torture. Delilah threw herself into work, helping her father with the endless tasks of keeping a ranch running through winter. They fed the cattle, repaired fences, chopped wood, hauled water from the well when the pump froze. But no amount of work could quiet the fear that gnawed at her, the constant worry about Franklin. Christmas came and went, a subdued affair with just her and her father. They roasted a chicken and exchanged small gifts, a new hunting knife for Delilah, warm socks for Daniel, but the holiday felt hollow without Franklin there. Delilah found herself staring at the bedroom where he had recovered, remembering the hours they had spent talking, the way his laugh had filled the small space with warmth. On New Year's Day, 1883, a rider came to the ranch. Delilah's heart leaped into her throat when she saw him approaching, terrified that he brought news of Franklin's death. But when she recognized Deputy Collins from Wilson, some of her fear eased. Collins would not be grinning if he brought bad news. "They got them," Collins called out as he reined in his horse. "The Sadler gang. Marshal Walsh and his boys caught up with them trying to cross into Colorado. 3 of them are dead, including Jack Sadler himself. The 4th surrendered and is sitting in a jail cell waiting for the circuit judge." "And Franklin?" Delilah asked, her voice tight. "Is he hurt?" "Banged up a bit, but alive and whole," Collins assured her. "He is the one who took down Sadler, shot him in a fair fight, or as fair as it gets with an outlaw. The marshal says Franklin acquitted himself well, considering he was barely healed from being stabbed." Relief flooded through Delilah so intensely that her knees went weak. Her father stepped up beside her, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. "When will they be back?" Daniel asked. "Should be another 3 or 4 days, Collins said. "Weather is slowing them down some, but they are coming home, Miss Turner. Your man is coming home. Your man." The word settled warm in Delilah's chest, and she realized she wanted nothing more than for that to be true. She wanted Franklin to be hers, and she wanted to be his, despite the fear and the uncertainty and the knowledge that loving a lawman meant living with danger. 4 days later, on a clear, cold afternoon, the posse rode back into Wilson. Delilah was in town with her father, having come to pick up supplies and mail, when she heard the commotion. She turned to see the riders coming down the main street, and her eyes found Franklin immediately. He looked tired and thinner, his face drawn with exhaustion, but he was alive and sitting tall in the saddle. Their eyes met across the distance, and Franklin's whole face transformed with a smile that made Delilah's heart sing. He swung down from his horse, wincing slightly at the movement, and then he was striding toward her, closing the distance between them with long steps. Delilah ran to meet him, propriety forgotten, and when he caught her in his arms, she did not care that half the town was watching. She buried her face in his chest, feeling the solid reality of him, breathing in the scent of horse and sweat and cold air. "You came back," she whispered against his coat. "I promised I would," Franklin replied, his arms tight around her. "And I always keep my promises." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the middle of the street, and Delilah felt like she could breathe properly for the first time in weeks. When they finally pulled apart, Franklin kept one arm around her shoulders, as if he could not bear to let her go completely. "I have something to ask your father," he said, his voice low and a little nervous. "But I wanted to make sure you would say yes first." Delilah's heart began to pound. "Ask me what?" Franklin turned her to face him fully, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Marry me, Delilah." "I know it is fast. I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You saved me in more ways than one, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. So what do you say? Will you marry me?" Delilah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Yes, I will marry you, Franklin Garrison." He kissed her then, right there in the street, and the townspeople cheered and clapped. When Daniel Turner walked over, his expression stern but his eyes warm, Franklin released Delilah just long enough to shake her father's hand. "I want to marry your daughter, sir," Franklin said formally. "I know I do not have much to offer right now, besides a deputy's salary and a whole lot of determination, but I love her, and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of her." Daniel studied the young man for a long moment, then glanced at his daughter's radiant face. "She saved your life," he said finally. "I know, sir. I owe her everything." "Then I expect you to remember that," Daniel said. "And I expect you to keep her safe and happy for as long as you both shall live. Can you do that?" "I can, and I will," Franklin promised. Daniel nodded slowly, then offered his hand. "Welcome to the family, Franklin." They were married in the small church in Wilson on a Saturday in late January. Delilah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and only slightly too large. Franklin wore his best suit, borrowed from Daniel since his own clothes had been ruined, and he stood at the altar with his heart in his eyes as Delilah walked down the aisle toward him. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by the townspeople who had come to respect both the brave deputy and the woman who had saved him. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Franklin kissed Delilah with a tenderness that made more than a few women in the congregation dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. They had a small reception in the church hall, with cake and punch and fiddle music. Delilah danced with her new husband, her hand in his, and felt like the luckiest woman in Kansas. Franklin held her close, mindful of his still healing wound but unwilling to deny her this simple joy. "Are you happy?" he asked as they swayed to the music. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Delilah replied honestly. "Are you?" "Deliriously," Franklin said, and the warmth in his voice made her believe him. They moved into a small house on the edge of Wilson, close enough to the ranch that Delilah could visit her father regularly, but far enough that they had their own space. Franklin returned to his work as a deputy, and Delilah found ways to keep herself busy. She took in mending and sewing to earn extra money, and she still hunted when the weather permitted, keeping their table supplied with venison and rabbit. Life was not always easy. There were nights when Franklin came home late, exhausted from long patrols or difficult arrests. There were times when Delilah lay awake worrying, wondering if this would be the night he did not come home. But there were far more moments of joy, quiet evenings by the fire, Sunday dinners at the ranch with her father, lazy mornings in bed when Franklin was not working, wrapped in each other's arms and talking about dreams for the future. Spring came, bringing green grass and wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. Delilah discovered she was with child in April, and Franklin's reaction was a mixture of joy and terror. He fussed over her constantly, worrying about every little thing, until Delilah finally had to tell him to calm down or she would ban him from the house. "I am having a baby, not dying," she said with exasperated affection. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, Franklin. I will be fine." But she secretly loved his concern, the way he made sure she had enough to eat, the way he insisted on doing the heavier chores around their small property. It was evidence of how much he loved her, and that never got old. Their son was born in December, almost exactly 1 year after Delilah had found Franklin dying in the woods. It was a difficult birth, long and painful, but when Delilah finally held their red-faced, squalling baby in her arms, every moment of pain was forgotten. Franklin sat beside the bed, his eyes wet with tears, and gently touched their son's tiny hand. "He is perfect," Franklin whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You are amazing, Delilah. Thank you." They named him Daniel Porter Garrison after Delilah's father and Franklin's fallen mentor. Little Danny, as they called him, had his father's brown eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. And from the moment he entered the world, he owned their hearts completely. The years that followed were full and rich, marked by the ordinary joys and struggles of life on the frontier. Franklin eventually became sheriff of Wilson when Collins retired to take over his family's farm. He was a good sheriff, fair and brave, respected by the townspeople, and feared by those who would break the law. Delilah supported him in everything, even when she worried, even when he came home with bruises or cuts from his work. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Catherine Ann when Danny was 3, and another son, James Matthew, 2 years after that. Their small house became fuller and louder, bursting with life and love and the chaos that came with raising 3 young children. Delilah's father was a constant presence, doting on his grandchildren and helping Franklin with repairs and improvements to the house. On winter evenings, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Franklin and Delilah would sit together by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Sometimes they talked about their day, about the children's antics or Franklin's work. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, taking comfort in each other's presence. "You ever think about that day in the woods?" Franklin asked one such evening, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her arm. "Sometimes," Delilah admitted. "I think about how close I came to never finding you, how different our lives would be if I had decided to hunt somewhere else that day." "I think about it too," Franklin said quietly. "About how you saved my life, but also how you gave me a reason to want to live. Before you, I was just drifting, going through the motions. You gave me purpose, gave me a home, gave me everything that matters. Delilah tilted her head to look up at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "We saved each other," she said softly. "I was drifting too in my own way. Just working and surviving, forgetting to actually live. You reminded me that life is about more than duty and responsibility. You taught me to love again, to dream again." "Then we are lucky we found each other," Franklin said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Or rather, I am lucky you found me." "I was lucky too," Delilah replied. "That day I was hunting deer, but what I found was so much better. I found you and I found our future." The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. Danny grew into a serious boy who loved books and learning, eventually becoming a schoolteacher in Wilson. Catherine was fierce and independent like her mother, and she surprised everyone by becoming one of the first female doctors in Kansas, studying back east before returning to practice in their hometown. James followed his father into law enforcement, becoming a deputy and eventually a U.S. Marshal, making both his parents proud. Franklin served as sheriff for nearly 20 years before finally retiring at 55. His body slowed by old wounds and age, but his spirit still strong. He and Delilah moved back to the ranch then, taking over from Daniel, who had grown too old to manage it alone. They spent their later years working the land side by side, raising cattle and horses, watching grandchildren grow up with the same sense of wonder and possibility that had defined their own love story. On a warm summer evening in 1920, 38 years after that fateful day in the woods, Franklin and Delilah sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. They were both in their 60s now, their hair gray, their bodies marked by decades of hard work and life. But their hands were still clasped together, fingers intertwined, and the love between them was as strong as ever. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Franklin asked, his voice soft with memory. "When you were hauling me through the woods." "I said a lot of things," Delilah replied with a smile. "I was trying to keep you conscious." "You told me I picked a hell of a place to get stabbed," Franklin said, and they both laughed at the memory. "Well, you did," Delilah said, squeezing his hand. "Middle of nowhere, freezing cold, miles from help. Not your smartest decision." "No, but it led me to you," Franklin said, turning to look at her with eyes that still held the warmth and wonder of that young man who had fallen in love with his rescuer. "And that makes it the luckiest day of my life, despite the stabbing and the near-death experience." "Mine too," Delilah agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder as they watched the sun sink below the horizon. "Mine too." They sat like that until the stars came out. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together through love and determination and sheer, stubborn refusal to give up on each other. Their story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but of quiet devotion, daily choices, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest adventures come from simply choosing to love someone with all your heart. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things, and in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Two lives, saved and transformed by chance and choice, woven together into something beautiful and lasting. A love story born in frozen woods and nurtured through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, all of it adding up to a single, simple truth. They had found each other, and that made all the difference. Daniel Turner passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 90, surrounded by his daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchildren. They buried him beside his wife in the small cemetery outside Wilson, and Delilah wept for the father who had raised her to be strong, who had taught her to survive and thrive in the harsh frontier. Franklin held her through her grief, just as she had held him through his own losses over the years, and together they weathered the storm. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story. The small bedroom where Franklin had recovered became a place of family legend, the room where their love story had truly begun. Children and grandchildren would ask to hear the story again and again, never tiring of hearing how Grandma Delilah had found Grandpa Franklin dying in the woods and saved his life. Was it love at first sight? One granddaughter asked, her eyes wide with romantic imagination. Delilah considered the question carefully. No, she said honestly. At first sight, I thought he was dead, and then I thought he was dying, and mostly I was just focused on keeping him alive. But love at second sight, maybe. When he opened his eyes that second night and looked at me with such gratitude and wonder, I think that was when I started to fall. I fell first, Franklin interjected from his chair by the fire. The moment I woke up and saw her sitting beside my bed, I knew I had found something precious. You were delirious with fever, Delilah teased, but her smile was soft with affection. I was clear-headed enough to know a remarkable woman when I saw one, Franklin countered, and after nearly 4 decades of marriage, he still meant every word. As the years turned into decades, their love remained a constant, weathering every storm that life threw at them. They lost friends and family members, watched their children grow and have children of their own, saw the frontier transform from wild and lawless to settled and civilized. The railroad expanded, automobiles replaced horses, electricity came to Wilson, and the world changed in ways they could never have imagined on that cold December day in 1882. But some things remained the same. The prairie still stretched endlessly under big Kansas skies. The wind still sang through the grass, and Franklin and Delilah still sat together in the evenings, hands clasped, hearts intertwined, grateful for every moment they had been given. Franklin passed away first, in the spring of 1925 at the age of 68. His heart simply stopped one night while he slept beside his wife, and he went peacefully, without pain or fear. Delilah woke to find him gone, and the grief was overwhelming, a physical pain in her chest that made it hard to breathe. How was she supposed to exist in a world without Franklin, without his laugh and his warmth and his steady presence? But she carried on, because that was what they had always done. She carried on for their children and grandchildren, for the ranch, for the memory of the man who had loved her so completely. She lived another 7 years, dying at 73 in the same bed where Franklin had recovered from his wounds all those years ago, surrounded by family who loved her. Her last words were, "Tell Franklin I am coming," and she went with a smile on her face. They buried her beside her husband in the Wilson Cemetery, under a shared headstone that read simply, "Franklin and Delilah Garrison, beloved parents and grandparents, together forever." Below that, their children had added one more line, a tribute to the story that had started it all. 2 lives, saved by chance, bound by love. The story of how Delilah found Franklin dying in the woods became part of Wilson's local lore, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But for those who had known them, for their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, it was more than just a story. It was proof that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that 2 people from different paths could find each other and build something lasting and true. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to the legacy Franklin and Delilah had built together. Their great-great-grandchildren would walk the same woods where Delilah had hunted that fateful day, would stand in the spot where she had found Franklin and saved his life, and they would feel the weight of history, the knowledge that they existed, because of one woman's decision to help a dying stranger. Every winter, when snow covered the Kansas prairie in white, someone in the Garrison family would raise a glass to Franklin and Delilah, toasting the accident of fate that had brought them together. They would tell the story again, keeping it alive, ensuring that future generations would know about the deputy who was stabbed and left for dead, and the hunter who saved him and stole his heart. It was a love story for the ages, born in blood and snow and desperation, nurtured through hardship and joy, and lasting long after both lovers had passed from this world into the next. A reminder that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, that a single moment can change everything, and that love, once found, can transcend time and death and become something eternal. In the end, that is what mattered. Not the danger or the hardship, not the wounds or the scars, but the simple fact that two people found each other in the vastness of the frontier and chose to build a life together. They chose love over fear, hope over despair, and in doing so, they created something beautiful that would echo through generations. The story of Franklin and Delilah Garrison was proof that heroes do not always wear badges or carry guns. Sometimes heroes are young women with steady hands and kind hearts who refuse to let a stranger die alone in the woods. Sometimes heroes are men who choose duty and honor, even when it costs them everything. And sometimes, heroes are simply two people who love each other enough to face whatever life throws at them together, until the very end. Their love had been tested by violence and separation, by grief and loss, by all the challenges that came with building a life on the frontier. But it had endured, growing stronger with each passing year, until it became the foundation upon which an entire family was built. And that, more than any grand gesture or dramatic rescue, was the true measure of their love. Years might pass, the world might change beyond recognition, but in Wilson, Kansas, the story would live on. The story of a cold December day in 1882, when a young woman went hunting for deer, and found instead a wounded man and her entire future. The story of how love can bloom in the most unlikely places, how kindness can change lives, how two strangers can become everything to each other. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the ages. Because in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, it was proof that goodness existed, that love was real, that happy endings were possible if you were brave enough to reach for them. And so the story lived on, a testament to Franklin and Delilah, to the life they built, to the love they shared, and to the simple truth that sometimes, against all odds, everything works out exactly as it should. They had found each other in the frozen woods of Kansas, and they had held on to each other through everything life threw at them, until death finally parted them. But even death could not truly separate them, because their love had been woven into the very fabric of their family, their community, their legacy. Every descendant who heard their story carried a piece of them forward. Every couple who fell in love in Wilson was inspired by their example. Every person who chose kindness over indifference, courage over fear, love over hate, honored their memory. The ranch house still stood, weathered by time but sturdy, a monument to everything Franklin and Delilah had built together. The bedroom where he had recovered had been preserved, maintained by the family as a reminder of where it all began. Visitors would stand in that small room and imagine a young woman keeping vigil beside a dying man. Imagine the conversations that led to love. Imagine the moment when Franklin first kissed Delilah and changed both their lives forever. On the mantel in the front room, there was a photograph taken on their 50th wedding anniversary, their faces lined with age but their eyes bright with joy. their hands clasped together just as they always had been. Beside it was Delilah's hunting rifle, carefully maintained and never fired again after her death, and Franklin's sheriff badge, polished to a shine. These were the artifacts of a life well lived, of a love well earned. Their children grew old, watched their own children have children, and passed down the stories with reverence and pride. They told of their mother's strength and courage, their father's integrity and devotion. They spoke of how Franklin would look at Delilah even after 40 years of marriage like she hung the moon, how Delilah would reach for Franklin's hand whenever he entered a room, how their love had been the one constant in a changing world. The prairie wind continued to blow across Kansas, carrying whispers of the past into the future. The seasons turned, winter giving way to spring, spring to summer, summer to fall, and back to winter again in an endless cycle. And through it all, the story persisted, a bright thread woven through the tapestry of Wilson's history. Two people brought together by chance and bound by choice. A love born in the worst of circumstances, nurtured through hardship, tested by time, and emerging stronger for all of it. Franklin and Delilah Garrison, whose story began with blood on snow and ended with two lives well lived, two souls completely intertwined, two hearts beating as one until the very end and beyond. That was their legacy. Not wealth or fame or grand achievements, but simply love. Pure, enduring, transformative love that had touched everyone who knew them and would continue to touch people for generations to come. Because that is what real love does, it ripples outward, changing the world one heart at a time, creating beauty in the midst of hardship, hope in the midst of despair, joy in the midst of sorrow. And if you were to visit Wilson, Kansas today, if you were to walk through that old cemetery and find their shared headstone, if you were to stand there in the Kansas wind and read those simple words together, forever you would understand. You would feel the truth of it, the weight of a love that transcended time and space and death itself. Because some stories are more than just stories. Some loves are more than just loves. And Franklin and Delilah Garrison's story, their love, was the kind that reminds us all why we are here, what we are meant to do, how we are supposed to live. With courage, with kindness, with open hearts and willing spirits, ready to embrace whatever comes our way and turn it into something beautiful. That was their gift to the world. That was their triumph. And that was how their story, which began with a woman hunting in frozen woods and finding a dying man, became a legend that would endure as long as people believed in the transformative power of love.